but He has called us onto a battleground. He has called us to stand for what He desires. And in this episode, we are going to look at how that orientation is movement, an embodied movement of the person in a non-drifting way, according to the rhymes and the rhythms of reality. You say, there you go, Terry Martin, a whole lot of words again. But reality has a rhyme to it because things get repeated and repeated and repeated, like a river that flows on a riverbed. It keeps winding and flowing and bubbling as it gets to the sea. And so reality moves according to rhymes and rhythms. And in that rhyme and rhythm of reality, you and I need to learn how to become oriented to that rhyme and rhythm, what we call the ebb and flow of life. As we call it, the warp and woof of the real world. So yesterday we started looking at chapter 1, 2, and 3. And I want to complete this in this episode because 1, 2, and 3 talks about you and I, the importance of the believing community gaining and expanding consciousness. In other words, an expanding awareness of who they are. When the church loses sight of who she is and what she is and whose she is, all three fused into one. When she loses sight of an expanding consciousness of who she is and what she is about, the culture goes to pot. The culture comes unglued. Ye are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. When the salt loses its savor, when the lights go out, the culture comes unglued. Western civilization is coming unglued in a way like she never has before. Mass migrations into the West, shifting realms of power and authority, wars and rumors of wars. But don't lose sight of what the 3 chapters are about. Paul prays in verse 15 to 23 of chapter 1, and then he prays again in 3:1 and 14 to 22. And between those 2 prayers are 2 blocks of what I call policies for action, because that's what doctrine is. Doctrine is not black ink on white paper that is static, that you memorize and you are catechized according to. I'm not against catechisms per se, but what I am against is that we don't understand reality in terms of sentences and propositions. Propositional truth is the currency of dispositional knowing. It's the currency of embodied knowing. When we are living the life, we will come up with sentence statements of what is believed. And what you believe is what has to do with your continuity of contact with the source of all being. Not just static statements. The scriptures wasn't written up as static statements. It was written as an unfolding story of experiencing God and experiencing life and living in a dynamic way, not in a static way. And so in verse 1 to 14 of chapter 1, Paul starts out by saying, I want you to understand who you are. I want you to have a knowledge and a grip of who you are. Get an understanding of your being. You are a new creation in Christ, and this is what it looks like. And then he prays that they understand the depths of this. In verse 15, that the eyes of your understanding be enlightened according to what God has revealed. And then he goes into a block in chapter 2 from verse 1 to verse 22, explaining again their onto-epistemology, what they are and how they are to be expanding that awareness. Become deeply aware of who you are and whose you are. And so he prays in chapter 3, verse number 1, and then he breaks off with some explanation, and he gets back to the prayer in 14 to 22 of chapter 3. And what does he pray for? He prays for the cultivation of capacity. How do you grow this capacity of becoming aware? That's why the two prayers are so strategic. Believers have a minuscule awareness that they are new creations, but they need to grow in that awareness. And then out of the growth of that awareness, as they become deeply aware, what happens in chapter 4 to chapter 6? They gain an expanding capacity. What is capacity? It is the power to do. The power to be. Capability has to do with ability. It has to do with quantity of ability. But capacity has to do with quality of ability. So it's capability with expanding capacity. Are you expanding your capacity to be what God has called you to be? He spends 3 chapters talking through that in the story. He talks about in chapter 4, verse number 1, that there is a hierarchy in the assembly for those who are new believers. They come in, they have the fivefold ministry at work inside of the believing community, and they are being edified. They are being built up because they need content that needs to be embodied. Not content just to fill their heads, but content to be lived out. That's why content is given. The focus is the development of character. And that comes through understanding the content in the context of life and living. And so the edification model is a conversational model that takes place in the early stages of the Christian life in an ordered hierarchy in chapter 4. But that hierarchy, very soon as believers mature, develops into a flat topology. From a tall ordered hierarchy, it moves to a flat topology. And people start to morph, and it is peer-on-peer edification. No longer this hyper-dependence on the paid professional. No longer this high dependence on the guru. We call it the pastor. Very interesting how we have moved so far away from the biblical edification model. It starts out hierarchical, but then it morphs into a flat ordered topology where it is peer-on-peer edification in the context of good faith dialogues around the scriptures. Not purely this one-way method that we have elevated to clerical George. He's the paid professional and he pontificates once a week. Now, unless that is very, very balanced out with good faith dialogue in small groups where believers are edifying each other, believers are not going to be built up. That's why you can have a believer, a follower of the way, walk with God for 50 years, but they are inch deep in their cultivation of expanding their capacity to be what God has called them to be. And then in chapter 5, he talks about living love. What is love? Love is living in such a way where I make personal voluntary sacrifices for the benefit of others. In my marriage, in my family, in my workplace and my workspace, and right inside of the assembly. And everywhere I go, it is characterized by laying down my life, personal voluntary sacrifice. Oh, we've lost this dimension. And then in 5:9-14, he talks about living in light, living as enlightened ones. How do you live as an enlightened one? Well, you live as one who has woken up. You are not woke in the 21st century definition of wokeism. That's nothing of what waking up is all about. Woke is totally liberal, lawless kind of living, living according to your glands and what your glands dictate, where all gender distinctions and functionality is obliterated, where you can have hundreds of pronouns in order to describe people. So if I want you to call me a cat, you're quite at liberty to do that. It's how senseless we've become. So be given to love, be given to becoming enlightened constantly, waking up to the newness of life. Arise, O sleeper, the text says, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. And then our capacity continues to expand as we walk in wisdom. Wisdom is something that God imparts in the context of life and living. It's not something you learn from a textbook. It's not something that can be transmitted and hotwired from one person to another. Because the moment you hotwire it, you lose it. When wisdom is hotwired, it becomes knowledge because you are transmitting downward. But as you live wisely, people will start to smell an aroma that comes from your life that is attractive. Yes, attractive, not a stench of death. Down here where we live, people look at Christians as those who have fallen on their brains. They're brain dead because they can't think. They can't dialogue well. They speak with an accent and they think with an accent and they reason with an accent. But they don't have accents. Everyone else does. Walk in wisdom. Expand your capacity, but it is based on an expanding awareness of who you are. Chapter 1, 2, and 3 is the backdrop for understanding 4, 5, and 6. You cannot jump into 4, 5, and 6 without understanding 1, 2, and 3. And we talk about husbands loving wives and wives submitting to husbands in a vacuum. I wonder wives struggle to mutually be submissive to their husbands as their husbands love them. And husbands don't have a cooking clue of what love is. And they make comments like, how could you ever love me? In the meantime, they have no idea how to love. Because you see, they were charmers when they were dating. And charmers are like snakes in the grass. Because that's not something that carries you through marriage. Charm. It's a godly character that will carry you through your marriage until you drop. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Living wisely in all the vicissitudes of the relationships, of the field of relationality that God calls us into. And that is what prepares us, men and women, listen to me now, for war. In verse 10 to verse 23. And orientation is a conscious capacity that enables us to see clearly, to see what is really real. And life is a war of stories. The unseen realm against the seen realm. And that's why your wife is not your enemy, nor is your brother your enemy, nor your in-laws and your outlaws, every other kind of law. And so if you can get the drift of the flow of the book, you're going to understand the beauty of war, because it will cost you having an orientation for the beauty of war. I trust that as you go into this day, you will enjoy the Lord and continue to grapple with some of the truths that we have exposed here this morning in this episode. We will continue on this vein and talk about the beauty of war in the next episode. Enjoy the day as you go with God, and goodbye for now.